Welcome back. Today we're going to look at the second part of Indicator 1.2, the steps to the revolution. Indicator 1.2 says analyze the early development of representative government and political rights in the American colonies, including the influence of the British political system and the rule of law, as written in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, and the conflict between the colonial legislatures and the British Parliament over the right to tax that resulted in the American Revolutionary War. We focused on the influence of the British political system yesterday. Today we're going to look at the conflict between the colonial legislatures and the British Parliament over the right to tax that resulted in war. Today's objective is to analyze how the conflict between colonial legislatures and Parliament over the right to tax resulted in the Revolutionary War. You should be able to describe why the colonists opposed taxes passed by Parliament and summarize the taxes and events leading up to the Revolutionary War. We know that England is an entire ocean's distance away from the colonies, which made it difficult to enforce law. England was also in turmoil during the Glorious Revolution, and they had their own things they were dealing with and focused on. This meant that both distance and desire impacted the struggles Parliament faced when enforcing law in the colonies. After 1720, the English government followed the policy of salutary neglect we talked about in Indicator 1.1, which allowed for the development of colonial assemblies which taxed the colonists. In the mid-1750s, the English became involved in the French and Indian War. Remember that under the theory of mercantilism, England had to supply protection to the colonies and thus began enforcing the Navigation Acts, which led to a crackdown on colonists who were smuggling goods in and out to other countries. So what exactly is going on? How does salutary neglect come to an end? The English are tied up in the French and Indian War. War costs time and money, so they aren't really paying attention to the colonies. Great Britain must expend resources to protect the colonists during the war. This is because of their mercantilist policies under the Navigation Acts. Following the French and Indian War, the British must raise money to pay off the war debts because protecting the colonists is very costly. Parliament begins to impose taxes on the colonists to recoup some of the money to pay back their war debts. The problem is, the colonists believe that only their colonial assemblies have the power to tax them, which causes a conflict between the colonists and Parliament. The British need to raise money to pay back their debts from the war. They're physically and financially exhausted after fighting for many years. To avoid any more conflicts with Native Americans, Parliament passes the Proclamation Act of 1763, which prohibits the colonists from venturing past the Appalachian Mountains. This establishes what is known as the Royal Proclamation Line. The colonists are angered because there's land which they want to claim, but the British do not want to return to protect the colonists from the Native Americans. The American colonists could have dealt with the taxes. We all do. They were not attempting to form a new government either. The colonists were trying to hold on to the government they had developed during the time of salutary neglect. The colonists did not want representation in Parliament, as they knew they'd be outvoted. They wanted British recognition that only colonial legislatures had the right to tax the colonists. Where did the colonists get the idea that only representative bodies could tax them? That's right, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. Take a moment to consider these questions. Are you confident that you can answer them? You need to understand the reasons Parliament struggled to enforce law in the colonies and what they were trying to achieve by ending salutary neglect. You need to know why Parliament began enforcing its mercantilistic policies. Do you think this was fair? Why do you think the colonists were angry about the taxes? When you're ready and feel confident that you can answer these questions, move on to the next part of this video. Now we're going to talk about all the different acts and events that led up to the American Revolutionary War. The first act you need to know is the Sugar Act of 1764. The government passed this act, which placed a tax on items like sugar, molasses, coffee, indigo, and wine. This is an import tax, which means it is a tax on items brought into the colonies. This act set up admiralty courts to hear smuggling cases. Parliament hoped this would put an end to the smuggling and the colonists trying to circumvent the Navigation Acts. Admiralty courts would not have a jury, only a judge to hear and decide the case. The colonists saw this as a violation of their right to trial by jury as British citizens. The next act you need to know is the Stamp Act of 1765. This act placed a direct tax on all printed material in the colonies. A direct tax is one which is placed on the income or profits of the person who pays it, rather than on a good or service. All printed materials such as newspapers and playing cards had to have a British stamp. This tax affected everyone in the colonies and further angered them. Many felt that action needed to be taken. Parliament failed to recognize the right of colonial assemblies to collect taxes. This led to the rally cry of the colonists, "No taxation without representation," and the formation of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, who led protests against the Stamp Act in the colonies. The Sons of Liberty led an effective economic boycott. Colonists boycotted British goods and tarred and feathered collectors. Parliament repealed or removed the Stamp Act, but promptly passed the Declaratory Act, which granted Parliament the power to tax and make decisions for the colonies in any situation. Do you know why the colonists were angry about the Sugar and the Stamp Acts? Do you know the difference between an import and a direct tax? How did the colonists respond to the Stamp Act, and what effect did the response have? When you're sure you can answer these questions, move on to the next part of the video. Parliament next passes a series of acts known as the Townshend Acts. These acts placed a tax on all goods being imported to the colonies, including paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. The colonists continued to boycott British goods, shouting "No taxation without representation." This statement reflects the belief that the government shouldn't tax the colonists unless they have been consulted. The next act you need to know is the Quartering Act of 1768. Parliament realized the unrest in the colonies could lead to revolt, so they sent the army to occupy major colonial cities. Rather than build barracks for the troops, the colonists were forced to house the soldiers and provide for their needs. How would you feel if you came home and were forced to take care of someone who didn't help you provide for your family, but ate your food and slept in your bed? Like the colonists, you'd probably be pretty mad. Fights often broke out between the colonists and the soldiers. The conflict between the colonists and the British Army led to constant squabbles and fights. One snowy evening in March, an issue between a rowdy crowd of colonists and some British soldiers on duty broke out into what is now called the Boston Massacre. The crowd of colonists began throwing snowballs and rocks at the soldiers on duty, and the soldiers called for help. One of the soldiers got knocked down, and nervously they fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. The Boston newspaper inflamed the incident, making it seem much worse than it was. The soldiers were not punished for these murders, causing more strife between the colonists and the British. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. This allowed the company to sell tea at a lower price than colonial merchants, which obviously angered the colonial merchants. This also threatened the effectiveness of the Sons of Liberty's boycotts. As a result of the Tea Act, and to get back at the British for the British East India Company's monopoly on tea sales, the Sons of Liberty, dressed like Native Americans, boarded the British East India Company's ships and dumped their tea into the Boston harbor. The tea was worth thousands of British pounds and angered not only the British East India Company, but the King and Parliament too. The King and Parliament were very angry about the Boston Tea Party and reacted harshly. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, in 1774. These acts placed Boston under martial law, closed the Boston harbor to all trade, and forbade the colonists from holding town hall meetings. The colonists knew they needed to respond. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met to discuss the growing problems they were facing. This meeting was held in Philadelphia and is known as the First Continental Congress. The delegates decided they would continue to boycott British goods, and they would begin to form militias or groups of citizen soldiers known as the Minutemen. Pause the video a moment and consider these questions. Can you identify the events we just learned about and the impact of each? What did the quartering of troops lead to? Why were the colonists angry about the Tea Act? What was the response by Parliament, and then the colonists' response to that? Each of these acts and events play an important role in the Revolution. Once you feel confident with each of these acts and events, move on to the last part of the video. British General Thomas Gage was in charge of the soldiers in and around Boston. He received word that he was to take the weapons away from the Massachusetts militias and arrest the leaders to be sent to England. Gage began to march his army out of Boston to carry out his orders. Paul Revere and others rode to warn the militiamen that the British were on their way. The Minutemen met the British Army first at Lexington in the early morning hours of April 19, 1775. Although they were defeated at Lexington, the Minutemen were able to defeat the British at Concord and chase them back to Boston. Thus began the American Revolutionary War. How do you feel about today's lecture? Can you analyze how the conflict between the colonial legislatures and Parliament led to the Revolutionary War? Can you describe why the colonists were opposed to the taxes Parliament passed? Can you summarize the acts and events leading up to the war? Great! You've made it through all of Indicator 1.2. If you have questions about any content from this indicator, make sure you check in with your teacher so we can help you stay on track for success.